I thought a fun icebreaker question today would be to talk about what was your favorite subject in school growing up, and how do you see that kind of playing out in your personality now? Throwing out this you cold, so we'll see what your thoughts are.
Why don't you go first while I think
But I, I
about my
did I did
answer?
have all day to think about it. So my favorite subject growing up in school was my math classes. I know that's not typical, but it just always felt like little puzzles. You learned a few steps and skills, and you put pieces together. Geometry was fun, except for when they made you write out the proofs, but like the logic of it and figuring out with this piece and that and that. Um, so yeah, and then that of course plays into, I went to school to be a physics teacher, and that's just using the math in the real world. So I'm very much a figure things out type of person. What are the steps? And so yeah, logic based.
That was probably what I was going to say, which probably explains that how we're siblings. But
Yeah.
I enjoyed math. I liked the math problems. I like there being a right answer. In
Mm.
some of the other subjects, it's like up for debate, which I don't always love. So I
So,
like
yeah.
the puzzle of figuring out the problem and that there's usually just one right
Hmm.
answer. And I agree. Geometry was probably my least favorite out of
Mm.
all of the math uh subjects that I learned. But yeah,
Well,
I'll have
that
to go with
these
math.
icebreakers are meant to connect us with our listeners, and we both just said math, which just eliminated 80% of the
Right.
people
I
who
will say,
relate
as
to
I've
us.
gotten older, I've been getting into history lately,
Hmm.
which like growing up I felt like was really boring. But like getting to learn it on my own terms instead of just like
Well,
how it was presented to me in school,
mhm. When you
I've
get to
enjoyed that a lot more.
see how it connects to things going
Mhm.
on today, I've enjoyed those sorts of things, which you get from some good YouTube videos that really show that stuff. Um,
Mhm.
yeah, I wasn't a fan of history either. I took AP US history, and that was a bad course for me. Well, okay. Welcome all of our listeners, whether you're here on YouTube and looking at us on the screen, or if you're on our podcast, we're on all the platforms. We are going to dive into week 3 of our study of Mark, which goes over Mark 5, Mark 6, with the accompanying passages that referenced. And this week, we're actually going to kick it off a little bit different. We're focusing on the key verses that's there on the study guides. And Kaylee said out of the two, she liked first one, Mark 5:34. And we're just going to read it and then kind of share a few thoughts, what we think about it. So take it away.
Yeah. And my microphone just go out.
Nope, I hear you.
Okay. I think I fix it. Yeah, I mean, I really enjoyed that first verse. It was Mark 5:34. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." And I just think kind of breaking down that verse, just starting with the word daughter, you just
Mm,
see just this community as I will probably get into talking about
mm-hmm,
the context around this verse, but it comes from him healing this woman of
mm-hmm,
her disease. Um, and because of her disease, she'd probably be like pretty separated from the society at the time. And so almost calling her daughter and bringing her into this like
yeah,
family relationship, endearing relationship, just is a really strong start to just this one verse.
mm-hmm,
And then it goes on to say, "Your faith has made you well." Uh, and at first I was kind of like, "Your faith has made you well." Is that just like emotionally, spiritually, physically well? Like, which one is it? But I think it kind of would probably be all of them. I think
mm-hmm,
because her physical disease was healed, I think that heals a lot of where her emotional disease, uh,
mm-hmm.
emotionally, what she was feeling. But then he says, "Go in peace and be healed of your disease." And I did, when I looked at this verse, there was an interesting word. The Greek word for healed there can be healed or saved. So I liked uh, that idea of like healing and saving being
Yeah.
like pretty similar there.
And my translation has freed. So
Mhm.
kind of a range of meaning there.
Yeah. So
Yes, I can't wait to get into that story because one, it's part of a American sandwich, but two, it's just an awesome story. So mine was Mark 6:41 and 42. Taking the 5 loaves and 2 fish and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to his disciples to distribute to the people. He also divided the 2 fish among them all. They all ate and were satisfied. Again, we're going to get to this verse, but it's a theme you see a few times in the Gospels where, Jesus talks about the living water, or, if you have bread, you'll just go hungry again. I bring the living word, you'll eat and be fully satisfied. So there's those references where, he's providing, in this case, it's a material possession, but it's supposed to point to that he's the bread of life that will satisfy us fully. Um, And then it's also just this really cool picture from the Old Testament, the feeding the multitude with bread and meat. Well, that's kind of what Moses and God brought to the Israelites when they were in the wilderness. So there's this kind of Moses kind of aspect to it. And as I put in our reading, and I know I didn't know this the first time going through, but in Second Kings, you have Elijah who multiplied bread.
mhm.
And so when I would first create the story, I was like, I didn't know that there was an Old Testament version of this. This is so cool. I bet a lot of people didn't know that.
Mhm.
So it's just a really cool passage, and we'll talk about it more.
Yeah. I like that reference too. I don't think I really remember that,
Yeah.
but it's almost this idea that Jesus, he, they had 20 loaves, he had five,
Hmm.
and they fed a few hundred, and he fed thousands,
Oh
and
yeah.
just he goes beyond
Way
what
beyond.
these Old Testament
Hmm.
um, prophets
Yeah,
were.
because there's the theme going through Mark where he'll try to point him as a prophet like Moses, or one of the prophets, or the Messiah. He's all, or a priest is another one that comes up a lot. And he's all of those things and referencing those people, but at such a higher level.
Mhm.
And when we get to it, this is a teaser for another series, The Line of Jesus. That just goes off the chart. Each person you look at, it's like, that's kind of like Jesus, only Jesus is better. So,
Mhm.
well, very cool. I hope everybody listening at home, and we have um, this is the first episode where we got to see all the views from our launch episode, and we got some people joining us for this. So we're very excited for that. If we miss anything that you had questions on, we do have a question submit spot on website, CastelineMysteries.org, Castelline with a K. And you can submit questions there, and we'll be answering those at the end. We're going to start off with a great story about demons and pigs. So, how's about I just give a quick recap of the story instead of reading the long passage, and then we'll kind of talk about it and see if there's questions or things that you've learned. So, where we left off was that Jesus calms the storms. When they land, they're on the other side of the Sea of Galilee, and they show up, and there's a man there in this kind of graveyard, caves area, possessed by a legion. So, it's giving this idea that there's many demons in him, and there's this interesting dialogue between him and the demons, and then they ask to be cast into pigs. He does that. The pigs storm off and all drown, freaks the people out. So there's just a lot of dynamics going on in the story. And then it kind of ends with the man wanting to go with Jesus, but Jesus saying, no, go back and share your story, which is actually the first time I think Jesus has been like, go tell people about this, because he's going off to the Decapolis. It's not going to cause issues for his ministry with that. So, what do you think about this story? What questions did you have? What things did you learn? And there's a lot to it.
I mean, this is a lot to this story. I think one of the first things that kind of stood out to me um, was that when the demon was talking to him, it said that Jesus had to give them permission. And I liked that idea. We've talked about Mark
Hmm.
constantly revealing more and more about who Jesus is, and this felt like another one of those of like
Yeah.
Jesus has authority over the spiritual realm,
He has
demons, angels.
authority over these beings that
Mhm.
don't align with him. and yet they
Hmm.
still have to obey. And that's just so
Mm.
cool.
Yeah. Yeah. So that was the first point that stood out to me. I also thought it was interesting. Um, I have no idea if there's anything to this, but
Hmm.
in the Jewish tradition, pigs are considered unclean. They weren't
Hmm.
allowed to eat pigs. And so just the idea that these unclean spirits were then sent into the unclean animals was interesting, but I don't
Yeah.
know if that has anything
Well, you kind of
there.
got this because not only were they unclean animals, but pigs, at least at that time, I'm pretty sure it's still practiced today, aren't really supposed to even be in the land of Israel. And even though they're up and away from where they normally are, this is technically still the ancient land of Israel. And so there is this kind of like interesting dynamic of he's cleansing the land from these things that weren't supposed to be there.
Mhm.
Um, I know you can, there are, I can't remember if this is today or if this was during Jesus' time. I think it's maybe both, but there is like one place where you can get pigs, but they have the pigs built up on a platform, so they're not actually on the ground. Um,
Mhm.
so yeah, I've wondered that before, and people have talked about it, but I did not in such a way that it's like a direct. This was surely a sign. It's just kind of people like to think about it.
Mhm.
My what I've learned about that is so he has this whole conversation with the demons, which is very interesting. That he kind of, hey, can you do this? And Jesus is like, that's fine. And you're like, why are we negotiating? Our American modern mentalities, you don't negotiate with terrorists type of thing. But Jesus does, and the first thing they do is they cause all this mayhem, and you're like, oh, Jesus, why'd you do that? Now they're making you leave, and it seems at first that it's like Jesus kind of took an L, even though that was really cool. But we'll come back to this sort of area later. So he sends the man off to the Decapolis, and when the next time they come back to the Decapolis, the people are just nuts to go and listen to Jesus. So while the demons probably thought, oh, this is going to mess them up, and the story seems like, oh, that's a bummer, you read on and you're like, whoa, the people were excited because this guy goes back and he's got this credible source of all the pigs died. And
Mhm.
so it's really cool that, God used it for good.
Well, that was one thing that it says when the guy had asked to go with Jesus
Mm-hmm.
after he had been healed, and Jesus said, "No, go home to your friends
Mm-hmm.
and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you." And that was kind of one of the application points to me is when you're able to share like and people can fit like see the difference in
Mm-hmm.
your life before Christ and after Christ, like how big of a testimony that is. And so that I don't know, I don't think I knew that they went back to that area later,
Mm-hmm.
but I think as we're sharing the gospel with people and being able to share like this was me before Christ and this was me after Christ
Mm-hmm.
to the people that are closest to us and would like know that there's a difference.
Yeah.
I think that I think that shows us just a powerful testimony. But then you also get in the next chapter, Jesus goes home and it's not quite that same story. So,
Yeah. And that is actually a huge, we'll tackle this at the end of the Mark series, but that idea of people sharing their own testimony is built into the structure of Mark's gospel, and it's really cool. But I know there's a lot of church tradition that really highly values people sharing out their testimony because, like you said, people can relate to that. And that's a big draw for, oh, that's kind of my story. And that's how I used to, that's how I feel now. I want to feel like what you look like. And
mhm,
people have a sixth sense for if you're faking or not. And I think if we're being genuine, then it's a good testimony.
mhm. Yeah, something when I was looking up at this passage that also stood out um, in those same verses. He
Hmm.
said, "Go home and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you." And he went away beginning to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him. So, like the similar wording of what the Lord has done and what
Hmm.
Jesus has done.
Mm.
So it's like, showing the equality, similarity of God and Jesus in Mark.
A very Yes. And that's the whole point of a lot of these, and we'll get to the loaves and fish. This is the part that the disciples, they don't understand that part. And so as we get through a few more stories and it names that their hearts were hard and they're just not getting that last piece of that Jesus is not just the Messiah, he's God. And so that's the part that they're missing out on. So yeah, that's definitely Mark leaving us a little clue for like, hey, it's there.
Mhm.
And we don't need to get into Greek on this series, but the Greek word and how they use the word Lord, how that was translated in their Greek version of the Bible, that kind of merging of the word Lord and God kind of gets merged together. So it's a really cool. Well, I think that comes up later on in when Jesus is talking to the Pharisees. So we'll dig more into it later.
Okay.
So yeah, we're still ramping it up. He can calm the storms, and even if a person's possessed with a whole legion, which is just a Roman, you hear different numbers, but you can just say a lot of demons. He can handle that, no big problem. So ramping it
Enough to
up
go
still.
into at least 2,000 pigs.
At least 2,000 pigs. I don't know how the math works out. They didn't teach me that one in high school. All right, why don't you move us into our next story with another summarizing, and it's kind of two stories merged into one.
Yep. So I know we talked about a Mark and Sandwich last time,
Hmm.
being a story that goes into a different story, then finishes out that story. And so this next story is about the healing of both a woman and Jairus. Is that how you would say it, Jairus?
Here's my rule. No one really knows the correct pronunciation.
Right.
Say it with confidence and move forward. Yeah,
Jairus's daughter. So
it's
essentially,
Gyrus.
Jairus.
I just go on.
Uh,
Just messing with you.
I'll say Jairus. So basically, Jairus was this ruler of the synagogues, and he comes before Jesus and says, My daughter's dying. Please, I know
Hmm.
that you can heal her." And so Jesus agrees to go with him, but they're kind of surrounded by this crowd, and so they're making their way, and there's this woman who's been bleeding or having a discharge for 12 years. And she sneaks her way through the crowd and just knows if she can touch Jesus's robe, she'll be healed.
Hmm.
So she does that. Jesus says, stops, and it's like, "Who touched me?" And his disciples are like, "You're in a crowd. So lots of people have touched you." And he kind of said that he felt, I don't know, power like leave him. And then the woman comes forward and kind of confesses everything. And that's
Hmm.
where we get to the verse that we talked about earlier. Uh, Jesus heals her. And then it says, while he was still speaking, people come from Jairus's house, and says, "Oh, your daughter's died. And so don't even bother the teacher anymore." And Jesus kind of still decides to go, brings some of his closest disciples, and they go and uh, eventually raises this girl from the dead.
Hmm. Which is so cool.
Mhm.
Again, ramping it up. And then if you weren't really sold on last week with the Mark and Sandwich, you're kind of, I don't know if that's a thing. Did you catch how like turned up it was in this story where a lot of things are connecting between the two stories? That it's like this is very intentional. Did you catch any of that?
Yeah, that was one of the questions that I had because the one thing that I caught, but I
Mm-hmm.
don't know if there's more, was she had been bleeding for 12 years and it was a 12-year-old daughter.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the only thing that I caught that I was like, is this significant? But I'm
Yeah,
guessing by how you're saying there's a couple
it's
other things.
yeah, it's not significant and like, oh, there's a magic number, but it's just significant that, and you see this throughout the Old Testament, you're repeating words or numbers to draw the attention to the reader, which is why you get things happening in threes or sevens or tens a lot in the Bible because they're trying to get you to, there's like an idea behind those numbers and they want you to go back to certain stories. So that's the one that easily sticks out is the 12 years. Okay, I'm supposed to be reading these two together. So I read it and I got to go back and reread it and see how it all connects. Um, and so it's kind of cool. That's one thing. He's healing this woman who he calls daughter, and then he goes and revives a daughter. So he's calling her that name, and that's another connection point there. But it's to draw your focus to it to not only see the similarities, but what I thought was cool is the differences. Here you have a synagogue leader, the guy way up here. He does come with faith and he asks Jesus. And then during that, you have somebody from the lowest level of society come and demonstrate her faith, where she's like, he doesn't need to do anything special. If I can just touch the corner of his robe. And so then he actually cites that. So when the leader gets told, Jesus looks at him and he says, "Don't be afraid, only believe." And so he just complimented the woman on her faith, and now he's turning to him, probably like, have faith, just like this woman, you have faith. So I think it's really cool that he's using that middle part of the Markan sandwich to kind of have that little theology about it's you have faith. Um, yeah, which I guess makes sense why the follow-up story is Nazareth and the little faith there. So,
Hmm.
any other interesting thoughts or comments?
No, I mean, I kind of dove a little bit deeper into, I liked how I re-referenced back in Leviticus. I'm like, what were the
Mm,
rules for this woman? Because she's been having this discharge for 12 years, and she wouldn't have been able to go worship in the temple. She wouldn't, I think when you were unclean, anytime you went somewhere in public, you had to make it known that you were unclean. So it would have been,
hmm
she would have been everywhere she was going, have to like, seclude herself almost and like,
Well,
uh,
and if she sits on a couch, no one else can
mhm,
sit on the couch. If her husband, if she has a husband, sleeps with her, he's unclean. So you can think
mhm,
about family members who would typically be, oh, we want to help our, but what a burden it would be for them to actually take her on. So you
mhm,
can imagine just how isolated she
mhm.
had been.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, I get a little chuckle having people go back and read that in Leviticus. It's everyone's favorite part of the Bible to read.
Mhm,
But it's like you got to read that to understand where this woman, what her life was like, because it was
mhm.
not easy.
Yeah, and the two things that stood out to me in both of these stories, um, was just her act of touching Jesus would have made him unclean,
Mm-hmm.
but he's like over the law, over, and like by her very touching him, he then, not only is he not unclean, but he like makes her clean.
Yep.
And then the same thing with Jairus's daughter is touching a dead body. You would
Yep.
also be considered unclean. But again, Jesus raises her. Uh, so I guess he didn't really touch. He touched a dead body, but then
Yeah.
raised her. So I don't know the result on that one. But
Yeah.
both of
It
these stories of things that would have made Jesus ceremonially unclean there.
Yep. He reverses the way that it typically works. And we actually got that back in when he heals Peter's mother-in-law. And she, instead of going through the proper cleansing rituals after he healed her, she just starts serving people.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, okay, they wouldn't have allowed her unless Jesus was like, no, she's clean. She's good.
And I guess I don't think that we've read a story about a leper yet, but it's pretty common. Jesus has
Hmm
healed lepers, and that's another thing. If you touched somebody with a skin disease,
hmm
they were considered unclean as well. So yeah.
Cool. It's a great story, and I love that Markin sandwich. It's a very clear one that really has points to make you see it.
Mhm.
As compared to what happens when now we're jumping into Mark 6. And before we get into the actual story where he goes into his hometown, this is so I wanted to bring up a question because last week we were reading and about Jesus' family coming to collect him. And I'm sitting here, I was like, oh yeah, and his sisters. And you're like, oh, that's not in my Bible.
Mhm,
So I just had a question because here in Mark 6, it does reference that he does have sisters.
mhm,
So we know that what my Bible put in, it isn't factually wrong. But when I kind of brought that up, that, oh, yeah, it says that some manuscripts don't have that and some do. I don't know where you're at and your knowledge of how the Bible gets written, but did that kind of like throw a little question mark in your head? Like, what do you mean? Like, some do and some don't? Like,
mhm.
or are you kind of pretty well versed in how Bible writing goes and you're comfortable enough that it's like, yeah, it's fine?
I guess my assumption when I read that is sometimes I feel like in the Bible you see things that say like men, but it's really talking about like men and women. It's just
Hmm.
talking about like human, you know. And so when I read that, that's kind of what I was assuming of
Mm,
like, oh, maybe it's this word that could be both brothers and sisters. But I guess what you're referencing is that's not necessarily the case. It's some manuscripts actually added this word that wasn't necessarily there.
correct. So, and I think a lot of people have this, not that they've been directly taught this, but that the Bible has just come down and has been copied perfectly through the ages, and it's all exactly as it was. And I think that's
Mhm.
kind of, even if they wouldn't say it that way, intuitively in their hearts, that's kind of what they believe. And so we don't have to talk about it now, but spoilers, the end of Mark, you're going to have to wrestle with the idea of, hey, not all of these versions or what they would call manuscripts agree with exactly what's in and what's not in. And so
Mhm.
there's a whole study to, okay, well, if the oldest one has it and then it's missing, maybe we rely on the older one and it got lost or something's in there. Maybe they added it in. So, like I referenced for last week, where it added and your sisters, some manuscripts added it. They may have just looked ahead and Mark and been like, oh, he does have sisters. Let's throw that in there so it connects. And so
Mhm.
sometimes you get people who are copying, they just add it in because they wanted to make this connections. And so there's a big question. Now, to comfort everybody who's freaking out, and this is new to you, there's nothing contentious or debatable about anything theological. We're sound on
Mhm.
all the theological. There's just minor things here or there. Doesn't change what Christianity is, but it's just an interesting, as you do more Bible studies, you run into these areas where it's interesting to dive into and not fear away from it.
Mhm.
I just
I
feel
think I
like,
heard, I don't know like a stat or like the
mhm,
exact stat, but I feel like I've heard, there are some small details, but
mhm,
most of them are kind of grammatical. None of the things that we have differences on are have like deep theological
yeah.
implications.
Even if there's, so in Mark, there's a big section that is debated, but even if you take it out, everything in there you can find elsewhere. So it's not that it's adding or taking anything away. So yeah, you're completely safe in the Bible. It is, in terms of historical texts, one of the most accurate, confirmable to its original as we have, because we have
Hmm.
just so many different manuscripts. Cool. We don't really need to talk about him at Nazareth if you don't have anything about it. That was kind of my thing I wanted to bring up, just because I felt a little off last week when you're like, oh, mine doesn't say sisters. I'm like, oh no, I'm caught off guard. I'm pretty sure it's here. So at least two, because it says sisters. We don't know how many total sisters he had.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing that really stood out to me in this section was this idea of like, obviously, Jesus has lived more years at this point than in his
Hmm.
ministry. And so it's just interesting thinking about like, okay, he was a carpenter with brothers and sisters, like from the stories of him that we have in the Gospels of him younger, he goes and like is teaching when they go to the temple
Hmm.
and is talking about the Bible, but like it's interesting that people in his hometown like didn't see this coming. Like it wasn't like Jesus who knows what Jesus's past was, but it wasn't like, it doesn't seem like they were aware that he was teaching or healing. It just kind of seems like they were like,
I mean,
is this Jesus?
it kind of makes sense. I mean, pick one of our siblings at random. They're now saying that they're the son of God. And there you go. You just immediately cracked up because you're like, no, I grew up with them, you know.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense. But when I'm thinking about like Jesus from a like, I have this like image of like, oh,
Mhm.
this guy who's perfect. He's never sinned. Like you feel like that would stand out, that a guy is just, perfect all the time. And
Yeah.
I don't know. Does he not get sick or
That's a yeah. Oh, healed.
yeah, right. So it's just like the fact that Jesus has lived that long and the people
hmm
who know him best are like, what is going on with him
I mean,
now? Like,
yeah, but it's funny how they're like, wow, he has wisdom. Where'd he get this? Like they recognize one that his teachings are amazing, but
hmm
then they're also just like, but we know who you are, and we don't like that.
hmm
And I like how that's how he quotes the a prophet is not without honor except in his hometown, among his relatives, and in his household.
hmm
So there's something to it. And then we get a nice shout out to James and Judas, who would later write a couple books of the Bible.
hmm
So most likely. Cool. All right. Another Markin sandwich. Did you catch this one? It was a double Markin sandwich week.
Is this he sends out the disciples and they come
Uh-huh.
back?
Yep.
Okay.
And what
I
happens in
didn't
the
catch
middle?
that, but the death of John the Baptist.
Hmm.
Mm,
So thinking of a Markin sandwich, he sends out the disciples. There's one half the sandwich. In the middle, the death of John the Baptist and that whole story. And then the disciples come
mm.
back. So what without having to write commentary, what would Mark be saying to anybody reading?
Yeah, I mean, I think that starting in verse 15 kind of sticks out to me because he sends them out and like it kind of comes back to the story of Herod and he's hearing about Jesus and some people are trying to like, oh, some say this is John the Baptist, some say this is Elijah, some say it's a prophet. Um, and so kind of some commentary on that and then coming back to Jesus feeding the 5,000, it's really showing the um the divinity of Christ
Mm,
there. But also, and I don't know if there's anything to this. We know, I don't know if it's this gospel or a different gospel, but one of the gospels do, oh, maybe it's this one. Mark 1. Maybe not. One of the gospels does explain that John the Baptist was this Elijah that
mm,
was supposed to come back, referenced at the end of Malachi that you had us read.
right.
So we're already revealed that, okay, this second Elijah was John the Baptist.
Well, there's so this gets into a bit of end times. John the Baptist kind of takes this persona of Elijah, announcing that the Lord is coming.
hmm
If you kind of read the scriptures, so that's just him taking that persona. But some people would say that at the end times, the real end times, the Elijah himself comes back.
mm
So there is this sort of, and this happens a lot with Jesus' first and second coming. There's like an image of what's to come and then what actually comes. Um,
Yeah. But then Elisha came after Elijah. And so
mhm.
the story of feeding the thousand that Elisha did in the Old Testament, would that be a reference to like, okay, he's not Elijah, he's the one who comes
Yep,
after?
the one who comes after. Yeah, I I think about that a lot. I mostly just get when I try to remember the stories of Elijah or Shah, I always get confused. But I think there is something to that. Um, But yeah, and so you get this story of John dying in the middle of the disciples getting sent out, which you could view this as like first century drama or dramatic tense. I don't know what you say. But the disciples go out. Oh, and John was beheaded. And you're like, what about the other disciple? This like, oh, I gotta figure out. But it's kind of this commentary of like they all come back fine. But as a reader who's now in the church and has faced persecution, this is Mark saying it's dangerous to go out and be a disciple. Like you could die. So that's why this is positioned right in the middle of that story.
Hmm.
How much do you know about this Herod and this story and what's going on there? Did you do any research on that whole debacle?
Um, Not a ton of research.
Yeah. So this is not the same Herod from baby Jesus times. That was um, Herod the Great, and he was actually like the main ruler. And he was kind of technically a king, but he was crazy and just killed people all the time. And Rome finally had enough with him, so they got rid of him and they kind of split up his kingdom a bunch to all of his like kids. So there's multiple Herods. Like this one is Herod Antipas. There's Herod Agrippa later on. You've got this wife who's Herodias. It's like Herodias. So this name becomes like a title. So Mark even like they're not kings, they're tetrarchs, I think. But Mark calls him King Herod, which is definitely like a little tongue in cheek because this guy wanted to be a king, tried to pretend like it. So Mark's going like, yeah, King Herod. Um, but yeah, he does some messed up stuff. He kills his brother so he can marry his brother's wife. Which I think I had some Old Testament passages to go read. Not supposed to do that. And Herod is technically Jewish because the way Romans like to govern is technically raise somebody into authority from the people. So this is why John would feel the need to go and preach to him that what he did is wrong because he's technically representing the Jewish people.
Mm.
Which is interesting. John does this, but you don't see the Pharisees who are all about following the rules going and telling him. They stay silent on that. Um, so he's calling them out. That gets him in prison. And then you get this weird song and dance whole scene. And I believe we read some passages in Esther where you go, there's a lot of interesting echoes going on here.
Hmm.
So what'd you think of that?
Yeah, I never ever thought about going back to Esther to uh but I thought it was really interesting. He like kind of does the same promise that the king
Mm-hmm.
back in Esther did of like, let me know what you want up to like half my kingdom. And you hear the king and Esther say that multiple times. Um, and so it was almost kind of, I don't know, it was like putting Esther up against Herodas as like they both were kind of given this similar thing. And you kind of
Mm-hmm.
see Esther who does like the righteous thing and Herodas who does not to do
Well,
that.
that and you have an actual king in Esther who could do things, whereas this
Mm,
king, he says, I'll give you up to half my kingdom. It's not really his to give. It's like,
mm,
okay, buddy. Um, so yeah, a very interesting story.
mhm,
The one other thing I'll bring up is um because if someone was a critic of the Bible, they would come to here, they'd read the story, and they go, hey, Josephus, do you know who Josephus is?
He was an Old Testament or a Jewish historian
Jewish
in the
historian, late first century. So not really around the time of Jesus, but he brings up John the Baptist. He brings up things that have happened, and the crucifixion. And he accounts this John the Baptist scene as having some sort of political reasons. So he tells a different story. So a critic of Mark is going to go, see, this is just stealing this whole historical thing and put in his own spin on it. Like, how would you even know what's going on in Herod's court? And you're like, oh, well, that's a good point. How would they know that? And why is it different? So actually, I don't think I had this on the reading, but I looked it up.
Mm-mm.
If you go to Luke 8, Matthew, Mark, Luke, oh, perfect. And it's Luke 8, 3. So this is also a great example of how there's credibility. You can have confidence in the Bible because there's unintentional consequences between the Gospels, where it's Luke's writing something. It's not meant to prove something in Mark, but it ends up doing it. And so in Mark 3, it's describing some people who are funding Jesus' ministry. And it says Joanna, the wife of Chuza, Herod's steward. So somebody who was funding Jesus' ministry is the wife of somebody right in Herod's court.
Mm.
So like they knew they could have gotten this information right from her because she might have witnessed all of it. So there's an example of where another book of the Bible, not on
Mm-hmm.
purpose, is proving this part of the Bible,
No.
which is a cool thing called apologetics. All right. We're doing great. We got a couple more stories left. We're going into feeding the 5,000. And then how about we haven't read a lot? How about we read this one? Would you like to read or me?
Yeah, I can read
Go for it.
through 44. Mark 6:30 through 44.
Yep.
The apostles returned to Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. And he said to them, "Come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while." For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And they went away in the boat to a desolate place by themselves. Now, many saw them going and recognized them, and they ran there on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. And when he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. And when it grew late, his disciples came to him and said, "This is a desolate place, and the hour is now late. Send them away to go into the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat." But he answered them, "You give them something to eat." And they said to him, "Shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat?" And he said to them, "How many loaves do you have? Go and see." And when they found out, they said, "5 and 2 fish." Then he commanded them all to sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups by hundreds and by fifties. And taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples to set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them all. And they all ate and were satisfied. And they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces and of the fish. And those who ate the loaves were 5,000 men.
I just wish I could see like how this technically happened. My science brain just goes, so like how did it break and then there's more? Did like
Mm-hmm.
everyone blink and it just appear? It reminds me of this. I took a youth group to some event and they had this Christian magician, which is a weird title, but he did this trick where he just like he's sitting there on stage and he just goes and a card pops in his hand and he tosses that card away. Whoosh, grabs another card, tosses it away. I'm just picturing Jesus just like more bread and tossing. It's like, how did this technically work?
Mm-hmm.
But what do you think when you read this story?
Yeah, I mean, I had the same thing. I kind of feel like I went through a little bit of a phase like years ago where I kind of heard these things of people explaining miracles from a
Mm-hmm.
very naturalistic point of view. And so I'm like, oh, but this like seems like something that's like, yeah, I have no idea how you explain this naturalistically, naturally.
Have you heard the naturalistic explanation of this miracle?
Oh no.
So, and this is the natural explanation because people want to say that there's Like when Jesus walking on water, oh, there was a sandbar. It's like, stop it. So their explanation of this is they get this boy, and the boy says, well, in Mark, it doesn't talk about the boy, but in another account, you get the boy said, hey, I have these loaves and fish.
Mhm.
And so then their logic goes, so all the people saw that this boy was willing to give up his little, that people decided to give up what they had, and then everybody was fed and there was extra. And it's like, hold up. If everyone had that much food, then they didn't have this problem in the first place. Like
Yeah, right.
your explanation makes there not be a problem.
Hmm.
So I would steer away from people who are trying to. That doesn't mean God can't do miracles with natural things. Like even
Hmm.
when we read about the parting of the waters with the Israelites, it says something about and God caused a wind to blow. So it's like he's using the wind, but that doesn't mean it's still not miraculous.
Hmm.
I'm going to point out a fun fact that just put a little bow in it, because we're going to come back to an idea with the feeding the 5,000 later on. Um, it's in another gospel that's telling the story that we get the clue that this is actually happening during Passover, I want to say, or the Feast of First Fruits, one of the two, but one of them where everybody is supposed to go down to Jerusalem.
Mm.
So this is happening on a roadway, kind of where people are moving through. So this huge crowd is just a bunch of Jewish people because they're traveling for the Passover that stop and want to hear from Jesus, and this all happens. So this is an entirely Jewish crowd of people that Jesus is feeding.
Mm.
And so
That's actually
far,
interesting because I didn't think about it this time, but definitely when I like read it in the past, I'm like thinking about back in those times when
mhm,
you're having to work to like just have food to eat. Like, I mean, we work differently, but it was
mhm,
like you're having to do a lot of work just to like make sure that you have food on the table at night. Like, how do 5,000 of these people just have free time to go listen to Jesus? And so that's interesting that
mhm.
you share that because it's like, oh, they were all traveling to go
Yeah.
to Jerusalem for this thing. So,
Yeah, the more you study, the more you learn. And then it's
right.
just everything becomes more exciting, as you can
Yeah.
tell by my excited spot. So, dig more, you'll get more out of it. Um, so yeah, Jesus' ministry so far, it's all been centered around Jews and Israelites. Um, I think the one story where with the demons is like the furthest so far in our story that he's gone kind of out of the way. But that was still kind of technically in Israel. But that's going to play a bigger theme as we move forward
Mm.
through a lot of these. Um, I think I already mentioned this at the start with the breaking of the bread and the fish. That is definitely conjuring up in the minds of the original readers a Moses figure, um, an Elijah figure, or Elisha. It's Elijah, right?
Hmm.
Um, but also, it's not that those people were the ones providing the bread. In fact, with Moses, it was God making it through the dew. So, this is, as we get to this next story, this is important to remember because there's a line that connects us back to this story with Jesus feeding the people with the bread, this miraculous sign. What we're
Hmm.
supposed to read in that is God is the one who provides. So when Jesus is the one providing, you're supposed to go, Jesus, God, the one who provides. You're supposed to make that connection, and yet the disciples do not. So
Mm.
I'll read this one. It's a shorter passage. And then having that in mind will help explain the last little line. Immediately, he made his disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side, to Bethsaida. When he dismissed the crowd, after he said goodbye to them, he went away to the mountain to pray. Well into the night, the boat was in the middle of the sea, and he was alone on the land. He saw them straining at the oars because the wind was against them. Very early in the morning, he came toward them walking on the sea and wanted to pass them by. When he saw them walk When they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost and cried out, because they all saw him and were terrified. Immediately he spoke with them and said, "Have courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." Then he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased. They were completely astounded because they had not understood about the loaves. Instead, their hearts were hardened. And that's why I took that moment, because when I read that last little line, I was like, hold up, we were talking about the ocean and waves. Why are we going back to the loaves? And so it's just highlighting, because remember the big picture of Mark's kind of spelled it out to us right from the get-go, but the disciples, people aren't really truly getting who Jesus is.
Hmm.
And it's going to keep pointing that out over and over and over. People don't get it. People don't get it. People don't get it until the centurion is the one who names it.
Mm.
What did you think of that slight reference to Job?
Yeah, I didn't like I've read Job through maybe one time, and
Mm-hmm.
so I didn't like think about it, but reading through the story first, I kind of put a question mark about like, oh, that's interesting. Like Jesus was just gonna pass them by. Like
Mm-hmm.
that seems kind of weird. A weird thing to add in of like
Yeah.
Jesus just thought he was gonna walk right by the boat and be like, "Hey guys, I'll meet you there,"
Right.
and there not be an issue. But then seeing that there's that connection back to Job and him, I forget what the quote was, trampling the waves,
Trampling the
I think
waves.
was
Yeah.
how my translation
That's a
put
cool
it. So,
translation. Yeah. And so it's a very similar phrase here that's used in Job. So there's been direct references to Esther, to Job. Mark's pulling from all over the Bible. And most of the time, you're just reading through, you don't notice that. And it's just
mhm,
another way that Mark is saying, um, without having to say, oh, Jesus is God, he's putting this action of what Jesus is doing in the place of what God was doing in the book of Job. It's just another
mhm,
subtle clue that Mark's trying to point you there.
mm.
Um, so I always find those cool.
They didn't have like access to the Old Testament. Like Mark wouldn't be sitting there with like the Old Testament next to him writing.
He could have gotten access. His family was well off, so
Okay.
maybe they had some copies written out. The
My point was
very,
kind of like, I would love to be so filled with God's
mhm.
word that I'm just like writing it
I bet he had a
like
lot
in
of that too.
about knowledge. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and it gets even more interesting because a lot of the references reference to the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation, because that was the most common. But then we have manuscripts of it in the original Hebrew. So there's a lot of interesting. I've had this question growing up, whereas Jesus is quoting from Deuteronomy, and he's like, "Love the Lord with God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength." I was like, "Oh, that's cool." And I flipped back to Deuteronomy, and I noticed, hey, in Deuteronomy, it doesn't say with all your mind. It has the other ones. So I'm sitting there like, did Jesus add to the Old Testament? Does that make with all your mind more important? And you have all these things, and it's just like, well, the Septuagint probably had it, and this one didn't. And so it's just Jesus quoting the Septuagint. It's just so cool.
Well, I
The
think I heard Septuagint is Greek.
Septuagint is Greek.
Yeah, that word in the Hebrew back in the day,
Hmm.
like would represent both the heart and mind. And in the Greek,
Yep,
they're different words.
correct. And so that was, I didn't know that. And so for a long while, I just thought Jesus added this in. So it must be important. Which is just me making stuff up. But
Mm,
I don't know. It's played into how I've grown up. So
mm.
it's fun.
So maybe this is too hard of a question, and we can maybe kick this to the end of the Mark Q&A.
Uh-huh.
But if the Bible's supposed to be written in a way that you don't have to be a scholar
Hmm.
to get it, and you see all these things that's like, oh, well, we know this because this scholar studied this and done
Hmm.
that. like how do you like reconcile that of like this should be the gospel should be accessible to all people, but we're like, keep going back to the scholars when people for the last 2,000 years didn't always have that information.
Sure. I have a few thoughts, but I don't think I could answer it great. But we had a sister-in-law who had a great idea that when we hit a question that we don't have the answer for, we are going to cast it with a K to the end of the episode, and I'll spend a day or two researching it. And at the end of the episode, if you stick around, which isn't that far from where we're at now, I'll answer it after I give it a bit of thought. I have a few initial thoughts, but I think that one, like you said, is a hard question. And I'll have a good answer. I'll try to have a good answer.
Okay.
All right. Let's kind of wrap it up. The one thing I'll point out for this last little section, or do you want to point it out? It's like the very last little line, which I find cool. Last
The
couple
one about the
sentences.
garments.
Yeah. So we just read
The-
the story.
Yeah, implored him that they might touch even the fringe of his garments, as many as touched it were made well. Yeah, my only thought was the story earlier where the
Mhm.
woman touched his garment and was healed. I'm like, I wonder if like that story got out or if like,
Well, you
there's
could
been
just
many.
imagine, and I think this is the direction that The Chosen went with it. But you can just imagine this woman who's lived this life for 12 years, paid money to doctors, it only caused it to be worse, and she gets healed by Jesus just by touching his garment. What does she do? She's telling everybody this Jesus guy's amazing. Just touch his garment. And now that becomes the thing. And you see a few different things in some other miracles where it is just about faith, but sometimes humans need like a thing to attach their faith to. So, like if this woman just thought, oh, if I just call out Jesus' name and he hears me, I'll be healed. Like that would have worked. But like
Mhm.
in her mind, if I just do this thing, that's what her faith was connected to. And so that's what the story people hear. And now they connect their faith to that.
Mm.
Anointing with oil is one that's still kind of used today, where the healing is connected to the oil, even though there's no power in the oil. It gives the person being prayed over that, like, okay, this happened,
Mm.
and that little faith connection point is how I've
That
added
was
the
a note
story.
that I had earlier because I don't remember us talking about Jesus ever really doing anything with oil until he sent out the disciples, and it said that they were
Mm-hmm.
anointing many with oil. And that hadn't come up before. So I wasn't sure if that was like a common practice or that was just something that they did and Jesus didn't. Or
Oil is a big thing in those days because it's your fragrance, it's your cleansing, it's your cooking. So it plays a big and significant role.
Mm.
But I do think it has that connection for it gives the disciples and the person they're praying over, like it's not just you're just hearing words. Like kind of not that the oil or the touching the garment, that's the thing that did it,
Hmm.
but it's so that your faith is concentrated on some sort of action. So that way we do it in church today. It's like, all right, let's put hands on. And that's like
Hmm.
you don't have to do that for healing to occur, but that's what we do in our
Hmm.
Christian tradition. Some churches will still do the anointing with oil, and I think that's actually coming back a bit.
Hmm.
Um, None of those practices are a must do. There's no magic in it, but it does having something for people to. It's actually real cool. We'll get to it later, but when Jesus heals the deaf man, he does a lot of things that are visual because the deaf man can't hear him. So he like spits on his hands and he touches him all over. So like it gives the man like something is happening.
Hmm.
Um, if you want to hear more about that, all those ideas came from Bible Thinkers study,
Hmm.
which I found very helpful for questions like the oil and those sorts of things. I already
Yeah.
have one question kicked to the end of the episode to dig into. Okay, very cool. Um, let's wrap up the episode. And Each time that we end an episode, I like to end with a small group study strategy or a Bible study strategy. And this week we are doing a Bible study strategy. And actually, we're going to do it as a challenge or we're asking you to try this out. One reason I think that my note sheets work is it's encouraging people to write, because writing is how we actually think and process. Writing and talking, which is why both of them work. You're writing, you're in a small group, you're discussing it. That's how we process information. And so, what I would like everyone to do is for week 4, at the end, after you've done all your studies, and before you either listen to this podcast or talk in your group, or Kaylee and I before we meet, is sit down with all that you've learned and then just start writing about what you've learned, kind of like summarizing what Mark, what is it, 7 and 8 is about, or what's the application. It's not so much about exactly what you're writing, but write a good summary or a paragraph. And you'll find that your thinking is being shaped as you start to write it. And you have to actually like commit to a thought, and then you kind of have these debates. And I think having that will be a good thing to try out for this week. So very cool.
Are we going to have to read our paragraphs too?
I haven't decided yet. Write it in a way that it can be shared.
Okay.
Dear diary. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for listening to us. If you're doing it on a podcast or YouTube, follow or subscribe or whatever it is on whatever channel you're on, and share it out for other people to try. If you're getting a lot out of this, especially do that. And we look forward to interacting with you guys. Throw some questions there on the website. And you got anything for him, Kaylee?
Nope.
Cool. Adios.